Saludos and greetings from the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños and the Planning Committee of the 40th anniversary of the Young Lords. Tonight, we celebrate and revisit the Young Lords' experience and the socio-political context in which they were active. This will be an opportunity to listen to new scholarly work about this pioneering political organization in the Puerto Rican and Latino community of the late 1960s and 1970s. The links that the Young Lords sustained with other liberation and social change movements of the time ensure that discussion about this organization are not limited to the Puerto Rican Latino condition. We are inevitably drawn into consideration of broader questions concerning the future of peoples in struggle everywhere, historically and contemporaneously. The challenges that the Young Lords and that the entire Puerto Rican movement addressed back then are still with us. Power does not relinquish its control gladly. Rights are not conceded without struggle. Validating the history of oppressed communities is not a concern of the elites. The questions faced by our movements are still with us. Questions about the approaches for achieving self-determination for Puerto Rico, questions about transforming U.S. society so that economic power and profitability is subject to social needs, questions about the dimensions of race, gender, sexual identity in constructing the vehicles for radical change, questions about the practical need for alliances with other social groups, and questions about the tensions, sometimes creative, always difficult, between reform and revolution. Yet another challenge that we face is that of preserving and documenting the history of our community and its various forms of struggle and affirmation. The Centro Library and Archives is the repository of valuable primary sources about the Young Lords and other movements of the time, such as the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, El Comité MIMP, the Puerto Rican Student Union, the Movimiento de Liberación Nacional. We also have audio-visual interviews of several leading activists. A new generation of researchers and documentarians is currently working on books, journal publications, dissertations, art exhibits, and films covering the spectrum of the Puerto Rican movement. But there is much more material out there yet to be collected, processed, and made accessible to the public. So we are making a call tonight for you to pass the word and to also to check your crowded closets, your dirty basements, and for those of you who have attics, check out your attics too. We are fortunate to have secured 4 talented panelistas for tonight's event. That was the original plan, and unfortunately one of our high points for this evening, la compañera Marta Moreno Vega, emailed us this afternoon that unfortunately she has to be out of action. She recently had knee surgery and the knees just aren't cooperating. So she really begged for our understanding and promised that the next time she was definitely going to be there, and she will also make available the materials that she had prepared for tonight, a very interesting presentation that she was going to make so that it will be a part of future resources for us. So we are without Marta, and so we'll give each of the speakers a little extra time. Each of these speakers, each of these panelistas has conducted research on the Young Lords, and each is well versed in the political, social, and cultural conditions of the time. Darrell Enck-Wanzer received his PhD from Indiana University in Communication and Culture and is currently an assistant professor of communication studies at the University of North Texas, specializing in race and public culture. Johanna Fernández, seated in the middle, is assistant professor of history and Black and Latino studies at Baruch College. She teaches 20th century U.S. history, the history of social movements, the political economy of American cities, and African American history. Her forthcoming book on the Young Lords will be published by Princeton University Press, by way of an example of that new generation of researchers that is doing continued work on this experience. Augustín Lao-Montes is Associate Professor of Sociology, Latino and Latin American, Caribbean, and African American Studies at UMass Amherst. He is co-editor of Mambo Montage, the Latinization of New York. And he is also publisher of Tecno Futuros, Critical Interventions on Latina Studies. He is working on a manuscript mapping the field of black politics in Latin America. And to pay our respects to Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, who is not with us, let's also acknowledge who she is. She is the founder and the president of the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute and former director of El Museo del Barrio and the Association of Hispanic Arts. She is the author of The Altar of My Soul, The Living Traditions of Santeria, as well as the book When the Spirits Dance Mambo. She also teaches Afro-Caribbean religions and Afro-Latinos in New York City at Hunter College, CUNY. So after a 15-minute, maybe 17-and-a-half-minute presentation from each of our three panelistas, we will be addressed by representatives of the organizing committee who have a message also to bring to us. Then we'll open up the floor to Q&A discussion. Centro views this evening as a moment not only to celebrate, but also to produce new knowledge about our community's history. We are all participants in this collective educational project. Let us maximize the opportunity so that Centro can enter this material into the historical record as well. Thank you for coming, and how about some applause for the 40th anniversary of the Young Lords. Before we go to our first speaker, I do want to ask Edwin Melendez, the director of Centro, to say a few words about the evening and also a very specific and concrete request and call that he would like to make. Edwin.
If you don't mind, I can speak from here. I think I can present buenas noches. I'm just here to welcome you to Centro event. And the occasion calls, we're making history as we celebrate history. And the occasion calls for what Andy says is a preservation effort from all of us to celebrate not only the Young Lords, but all the social movements that the Puerto Rican community has sparked in New York City, and is so much part of our heritage. So I just want to appeal to you to look in those basements and attics that Andy mentioned. There are forms there, and the most critical thing, we have some of our arguments in the audience, one and so forth. The most important thing is that we identify what you have, and I just want to make that appeal to you. You don't have to give it to us now, you don't even have to give it to us, but it's important that the scholars and future generations of people will have access to that wealth of information. So we just want to make that appeal to you. In any case, let's continue making history, but before we go on, I'd like to thank the organizer, Andy, and all the organizing committee that put all this together, and our wonderful staff here at Centro that made this night possible. So thank you very much, and an applause to you for organizing this.
Y ahora con ustedes, el profesor Darrell Enck-Wanzer to kick it off.
Thank you for having me. In his essay entitled On Revolutionary Nationalism, published in 1970 in the Young Lords biweekly newspaper Palante, Felipe Luciano argues passionately, I quote, Colonialism has messed our minds up so badly that psychologically we don't even know who we are and where we come from. We reject our cultural values and basic human values by imitating that which is not natural to us and by stomping on our own reflections. We've been systematically taught to hate ourselves while being reminded constantly by racist America that we ain't her kind of people either. Puerto Ricans have suffered as a group, racially and culturally. Now, in underscoring the cultural and racial dimension of the oppression Puerto Ricans faced, Luciano helped to articulate one of the key motivations and issues for the Young Lords, to confront racism, especially as it is rooted in and exacerbated by relations of coloniality. That this was linked to anti-colonial politics, however, is hardly a surprise to anyone familiar with the Young Lords or late 60s, early 70s radicalism in general. In the era saw a host of groups, from the Young Lords to the Black Panthers, Mecha, the Brown Berets, AIM, and others, who advanced a set of demands intent on dismantling colonial powers and challenging imperialisms. The relationship between such an anti-colonial politics and discourses of race and racialization, especially within the Young Lords, however, is understudied. In my talk here today, I want to explore these discourses of race and racialization that emerged in the New York Young Lords. I'm particularly interested in adding some texture to the already existent literature on race and racism in Nuyorican political discourse. In so doing, I argue that the Young Lords' discourse on race, that is, the way they engage race as such, is articulated at least as much to an ethnicity paradigm as to a nation-based paradigm, while their discourses on racism emerges out of their analysis of colonialism. The interplay between these slightly different paradigmatic approaches to race and racism respectively may demonstrate a more nuanced overall approach to racial formation by the Young Lords than has so far been considered. In making this argument, I will begin by reviewing some of the literature on race and racism amongst Nuyoricans generally and the Young Lords in particular. Next, I want to turn to some representative texts by the Young Lords that explicitly engage race and racism as key problematics that demand critical attention and political intervention. And finally, I end by suggesting ways in which the Young Lords enrich and are enriched by a racial formation perspective on race consistent with scholars like Michael Omi, Howard Winant, and David Theo Goldberg. Now, in his introductory chapter to the landmark volume, The Puerto Rican Movement, Andrés Torres underscores the importance of race in Puerto Rican social movements, arguing, quote, "More than anything else, it is Puerto Ricans' nationality and nation that define them. This otherness has a peculiar origin because it arises from a very specific experience of U.S. colonialism in Puerto Rico," end quote. Torres seems to conflate race, ethnicity, and nation in his explanation, which is perfectly reasonable. Geodi Puri, for example, demonstrates various ways in which ethnic attachments are imbricated with national claims throughout the world. It is also true that in the Young Lords, a nationalist rhetoric, one that Jeffrey Ogbar calls radical ethnic nationalism, formed a significant dimension of their political discourse. According to Ogbar, quote, "Adherents of Puerto Rican independence, the Lords denounced the cardinal three evils of revolutionary nationalists: capitalism, racism, and imperialism," end quote. Articulating their nationalism to a third world consciousness, the Lords broke with previous generations of nationalists in tapping into a specific kind of anti-colonial discourse that rejected whiteness. It's important to note, of course, that such a rejection of normative whiteness was inherently counter-hegemonic within Puerto Rican political discourse. As Miriam Jimenez Roman argues, a, quote, "widely accepted belief in the superiority of whiteness and its corollary, the inferiority of blackness, was popularly expressed in the notion of improvement of the race." And the Young Lords rejected this dominant notion. Indeed, as Iris Morales shows, quote, "The organization opposed white supremacy and cultural genocide, the devaluation and destruction of our culture. Instead, we celebrated our African ancestry and culture. Members wore large afros, and some assumed African names," end quote. Such complex racial politics took place in large part on a backdrop of complex anti-colonial politics that advanced an intersectional critique of racism, sexism, and capitalist exploitation, which Agbar captures well in his analysis that's published in the Centro Journal. Agbar shows that one key difference between the Young Lords' nationalism and island-based nationalism was the Lords' racial consciousness and rejection of normative whiteness. In doing so, Agbar attributes great significance to the Young Lords' racial politics, but it kind of stops short of offering a robust analysis of the New York Young Lords' discourse or policies on race vis-a-vis revolutionary nationalism. Instead, he lets the political stances of Black power function as a placeholder, undergirding the Young Lords' radical politics, and supplements this with some of the earliest recorded statements from the Chicago Lords' Chacha Jimenez, which make reference to race, or rather use racial terms like white, black, etc. Such inattention to the actual discourse of the New York Young Lords, however, is not uncommon. Roberto Rodriguez Morazani, for example, curiously attributes the most significant discourse on race in the late 60s and 70s to activists, but then all but ignores the work of US-based activists like the Young Lords in his historical review. In his analysis of the relationship between race and anti-colonial struggle, Rodriguez Morazani argues, quote, "The question of race and racism proves difficult and problematic within the context of an anti-colonial struggle based on a nationalist imaginary that denied or subordinated the significance of the African and denied or subordinated the question of racism as it existed within Puerto Rican society," end quote. Such an analysis, however, seems to miss the significant ways in which US-based nationalists like the Young Lords represented a challenge to island-based nationalism through a robust discourse confronting racism. So it's toward that discourse that I now want to turn my attention. The Young Lords' discourse about race and racism is complicated, to say the least. While there is certainly a significant element of this discourse that is guided by an anti-colonial political commitment, such a nation-based perspective only tells part of the story. Specifically, the Lords advanced a critique of racism that saw it as rooted in some specific social, historical, and material way in Puerto Rican coloniality and even the broader colonial experience of the Third World. Race itself, however, was often articulated differently by the Lords, and it's important to recognize this distinction between race and racism. Race and racism, argues Howard Winon, should not be used interchangeably, because one, race, refers to the socio-historical articulation of a category, and the other, racism, references a particular stylization of that category. David Theo Goldberg would concur in arguing, quote, "Race has historically concerned the fabrication of social homogeneities, their making and their embroidery, arrangement and order, management and commerce. Racism concerns the maintenance of homogeneity's contours, militarizing their borders, patrolling their places of possible transgression," end quote. While interrelated, to be sure, race and racism are conceptually distinct, and the articulations of each serve particular, if complementary, functions. That said, how do the Lords articulate racism and race respectively? As I mentioned earlier, racism is oftentimes linked up to histories and practices of colonialism, both Spanish and U.S. American. In an essay on colonized mentality that appeared in the 1971 pamphlet Ideology of the Young Lords Party, Denise Oliver writes, quote, "This colonization is responsible for the racism that exists in our nation," end quote. Moreover, she says, quote, "Most people will tell you that we're all Puerto Ricans and we're all different colors. None of us are black or white. We're just Puerto Ricans. But that doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist. It is so deep that we just don't see it anymore," end quote. For Oliver and the Lords, racism and colonialism become intertwined in a complex, mutually reinforcing process. So while colonialism is responsible for racism, racism plays a central role, rather than being merely epiphenomenal, in securing coloniality's ideological hold. "We're all racists," Oliver writes, "not because we want to be, but because we are taught to be that way, to keep us divided, because it benefits the capitalist system." And moreover, the racism authorized by and authorizing coloniality expanded to a broader context within the United States. Pablo Guzman, in the Lord's book Palante, Young Lord's Party, illustrates what he calls the New York perspective, the New York point of view on racism. He writes that a, quote, high degree of racism existed between Puerto Ricans and blacks and between light-skinned and dark-skinned Puerto Ricans. We had to deal with this racism because it blocked any kind of growth for our people, end quote. Such a blockage of growth is long-standing, according to Morales, going back to the Spanish who, quote, justified inhumanity and murder, saying the Indians were savage, unchristian, and of another race, and justified slavery and rape, saying that the African was inferior, uncivilized, and of an alien race, end quote. Furthermore, when the U.S. invaded Puerto Rico in 1898, Morales continues, racism was reinforced and intensified by them. Now, this led many lords throughout their writings in books, pamphlets, and their newspaper to refer to America written in the lowercase letters and spelled with a KKK in place of the letter C. Morales writes, quote, Americans cannot accept us because they believe that the racial mixture has caused a decline in our mental and physical capabilities. That's why at best the Americans are paternalistic or just out-and-out racist pigs, end quote. In this last passage, we start to see more of a slippage between a discourse focused on racism, connected in some important way to colonialism, and race as such. Morales and others reference ideologies and policies of racial mixture, right, which have been a long-standing important component of U.S. racial homogeneities and border patrolling. While she clearly challenges the racist implications of such an ideology, the underlying biologization and ethnicization of race isn't explicitly addressed. This is true also of Guzman, who, when referring to Puerto Ricans' attitudes toward race consciousness, writes, quote, Puerto Ricans said, well, yeah, those blacks got a hard time, you know, but we ain't going through the same thing. This was especially true for the light-skinned Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans like myself, who were dark-skinned, would look at Afro-Americans, couldn't do that, because to do that would be to escape into a kind of fantasy, because before people called me a spick, they called me a nigger, end quote. Now here Guzman locates race and skin color, phenotype, and ethnicity, but the next sentence sort of undermines that a little. The interplay between race and racism is important to understand his position because Guzman articulates racism as a kind of symbolic economy of inequitable social relations. Like for Morales, this inequity plays an important role in articulating the category of race itself, while guarding against and containing racialized individuals. In the context of an anti-colonial politics fighting racism, however, the Young Lords tap into what was then a dominant paradigm for conceptualizing race as ethnicity. Stressing the importance of the national question, Guzman writes, quote, we felt we had to organize where we were at, so that Chicanos were going to have to organize Chicanos, blacks were going to have to organize blacks, Puerto Ricans, etc., until we came to that level where we could deal with one umbrella organization and could speak for everybody. But until we eliminate the racism that separates everybody, that will not be possible, end quote. This is an important and complex passage. On the one hand, Guzman argues that national organizing is key to addressing racisms rooted in specific conditions of coloniality. While racism, as we saw above, is symbolic and practiced, race is rooted in ethnicity and nationality. While we certainly can't deny the importance of a colonial analysis in the Young Lords' formulation of an analysis of racism, it seems like it would be a mistake to reduce everything to some aspect of coloniality. Race and racism are figured within an oppositional, revolutionary nationalist discourse and within an ethnicity paradigm. At the same time, the Young Lords seem to feature race and racism as central to their social analysis, more so than Omi and Wanan recognize either nation-based or ethnicity paradigms generally doing. Ultimately, Omi and Wanan's critique of the nation-based paradigm, as well as all the others, is that they, quote, all neglect the specificity of race as an autonomous field of social conflict, political, organization, and cultural and ideological meaning. But in the context of Puerto Ricans in the U.S., questions of nation and colonialism are hardly epiphenomenal. Rather, they are in some sense central to the process of racialization and racial formation. Now, Ramon Grossfogel strongly defends some notion of coloniality of power as a key means for engaging Puerto Rican racialization. Coloniality of power, he argues, quote, addresses how social power relations today continue to be organized, constituted, and conditioned by the European/non-European access built globally during centuries of Western colonial expansion, end quote. Furthermore, he briefly critiques Enck-Wanzer's racial formation perspective as being insufficient to deal with the socio-historical specificities of coloniality. Indeed, it would seem that is the case given the way in which Enck-Wanzer critique nation-based approaches to race, as I just mentioned. But in their critique of the nation-based paradigm for explaining race and engaging racisms, Enck-Wanzer make a critical exception for Puerto Ricans. While the quote, analogy between U.S. conditions and colonial systems of discrimination composed of colonizers and colonized does not automatically carry over into post-colonial society, end quote, they recognize that in the context of Puerto Ricans, it is not simply an analogy. As such, the question with which I want to end is this. How do the Young Lords help to bridge the gap between Grossfogel and Enck-Wanzer so that we might have a differently productive way to theorize race and racism? Enck-Wanzer define race as, quote, a concept which signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of human bodies, end quote. While race invokes biologically based human characteristics, the hierarchical arrangements and basic intelligibility of skin color, phenotype, etc. in the context of race is, quote, always and necessarily a social and historical process. They continue, and excuse the long quotation here. Everybody learns some combination, some version of the rules of racial classification and of her own racial identity, often without obvious teaching or conscious inculcation. Thus, we are inserted in a comprehensively racialized social structure. Race becomes common sense, a way of comprehending, explaining, and acting in the world. A vast web of racial projects mediates between the discursive and representational means in which race is identified and signified on the one hand, and the institutional and organizational forms in which it is routinized and standardized on the other. Racial formation, therefore, is a kind of synthesis and outcome of the interaction of racial projects on a society-wide level. Now, in approaching race, the key thing for Enck-Wanzer is that our theoretical and critical lens view race as a category that is centrally constitutive of our social world. While they make an unelaborated exception for Puerto Ricans, they are certainly too quick to dismiss coloniality. At the same time, Grossfogel may be too quick to dismiss the centrality of race and racism as not merely related to coloniality of power. In conclusion, the Young Lords' discourse on race and racism, then, is a bridge of sorts for this conceptual chasm. Whether intentionally or not, the Young Lords articulate a productive tension between their discourse on racism, which sees it as emerging out of, along with, and undergirding colonial domination, and their discourse on race, which largely adopts a dominant vocabulary, but tempers that vocabulary with their critique of American racism. Indeed, in challenging racisms, the Young Lords also challenge a broader common sense about race, including the critical intersections of race, gender, and class. Such an intersectional analysis is practiced in the Young Lords' position paper on women, and is recognized by Ogbar in his analysis of the Young Lords' nationalism. Unlike what Enck-Wanzer allege of other nation-based organizations' approaches, the Young Lords most definitely did not neglect the specificity of race. While this talk only begins to scratch the surface of a complex discourse of race and racialization in the New York Young Lords, I hope to have started the process of adding local historical specificity to existent literature on race in New York grassroots politics, and staking out some hybrid theoretical commitments that may enrich our discussions further. Just as Guzman saw the Young Lords as, quote, showing people an alternative, end quote, so too are the Young Lords still showing us alternatives today. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank the organizers of this event, Professor Torres and the Centro, for inviting me and for hosting what will be a lovely meal afterwards. My talk essentially attempts to connect the history of the Young Lords with the political economy of the city and explore the ways in which the political economy of New York stimulated and gave rise to a radical politics. The rise of the Young Lords was a product of a double incidence of displacement in the experience of Puerto Ricans in the second half of the 20th century. The first displacement was the result of Operation Bootstrap, which unleashed an exodus of coffee and tobacco growers from the island of Puerto Rico to the U.S. mainland after World War II. The second displacement was experienced here on the mainland by the new migrants and their children. And it took the form of urban displacement under the guise of urban renewal and the displacements produced by post-war deindustrialization. The emergence of the Young Lords can be understood as an attempt to address the material impoverishment and psychological trauma produced by displacement, and it can be understood as an attempt to challenge the American colonial project in Puerto Rico. And I'd like to show just a brief clip that I prepared for the 40th anniversary. And this is the voice of Luis Acosta Garden, who's, I think, here.
The Young Lords were an initiation for a whole generation of people into their culture and to their history. All of a sudden I knew why my mother was angry, why my father was angry, and I no longer could blame them for anything. All of a sudden I knew that they were victims in a big show, because we were Puerto Rican and we were living here and we understood the beauty and the ugliness, but we didn't understand why. The Young Lords came to explain why.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to bear with me while I get my PowerPoint underway here. Here's an article on urban renewal that appeared in the newspaper of the Young Lords, Palante, and this was part of that second displacement that I suggest, and others, which fueled the Young Lords' radicalism. In many ways, the rise of the Young Lords, and before that, the Puerto Rican riots in New York in the summer of 1967, would put an end to the depiction of Puerto Ricans in the mainstream press of the 1950s and the early 1960s as, quote, mild-mannered, long-suffering, and submissive people. In many ways, these descriptions of Puerto Ricans in the 1950s and 1960s echo the contemporary perception of Mexicans. The timing of Puerto Rican migration made the disruption of this narrative possible. Puerto Rican migration and its coincidence with the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and the women's movement would have a tremendous impact on the consciousness of a new generation of mainland-born Puerto Ricans. And the Young Lords would come to play a crucial role in the expression of this very distinct urban Puerto Rican experience and identity. It was the rise of the U.S. as major world power after World War II and the centrality of Puerto Rico to the project of American hegemony that unleashed the double displacement of Puerto Ricans, about which I spoke, and that helped fuel the rise of a group like the Young Lords, but also of its politics. As a colony of the U.S., Puerto Rico was seen as a critical laboratory where market strategies could be developed, tested, and deployed to Latin America and other third world nations for the purpose of integrating these predominantly agricultural economies into the world system. But ironically, and this is where the politics of the Young Lords begins to emerge. Ironically, the post-Bretton Woods U.S.-led economic restructuring of the Third World that launched the modernization of economies like Puerto Rico also created unanticipated sources of cheap labor pools abroad that pressured domestic industries to seek cheaper production costs at home. This meant that American cities like New York and Chicago, which had traditionally housed American industries, began to experience a long-term process of industrial decline as companies began to move elsewhere in search of cheaper production costs. Deindustrialization created a sizable class of permanently unemployed and discouraged young workers, a completely new development in modern American urban history. In New York, the Bureau of Labor Statistics began to publish reports about this trend and its impact on Black and Puerto Rican men in their prime working years. In 1966, these reports found that 47% of Puerto Ricans in New York were either unemployed, underemployed, or permanently out of the labor force for lack of success in finding employment. In Chicago, 22% of industry left to the suburbs between 1950 and 1977. And part of what these reports suggested was that in comparison to Black and white employment, Puerto Rican employment or underemployment was even worse. And this really echoes a study that was released recently that Puerto Ricans continue to hold the lowest rank, really, socioeconomically in American society. And I think that the double displacement that Puerto Ricans experienced in the 20th century has a lot to do with this crisis. City conditions were further worsened by the tax base erosion brought about by white flight. These conditions, combined with police brutality and northern racism on the one hand, and on the other, the raised expectations about change produced by the Southern Civil Rights Movement, led to the riots. And the riots functioned as a call to action for radical activists. And many of you might not know, or some of you do know, that Puerto Ricans rioted both in Chicago in 1966 and here in New York in 1967. The emergence of the Black Panther Party in 1966 was the most dramatic example of this development, of radicals responding to the riots and the crisis that the riots dramatized. But these post-war changes in the structure of the city also influenced the character and politics of organizations like the Young Lords. At a time when the post-war urban economy created a class of permanently unemployed urban dwellers, it is no surprise that radical organizations like the Young Lords and the Black Panthers would launch a critique of this development, while at the same time deciding to organize what they called, quote, the young lumpen proletarian cats. Here, they were referring to a term coined by Karl Marx to describe the permanently unemployed and discouraged workers living on the margins of society. Armed with theories emerging from national liberation movements, organizations like the Young Lords were reacting to special conditions at a time, at the same time that they were trying to make sense of them. However, at the local level, their movement reflected the distinctive social features of the urban environment in which they emerged. These movements were a response to the new structures of capitalism and its modernization in the second half of the 20th century. In the cities, the burden of these structural changes was disproportionately borne by people of color because they happened to be migrating to the city at the same time that these structural changes were taking place. However, in public discourse in the 1960s, urban poverty was increasingly seen as a racial phenomenon or as a product of the cultural deficiencies of certain groups. In fact, thinly veiled racist theories about the dysfunctionality of the Black family and the propensity for violence among Black and Latino males came to explain the causes of this new urban crisis. Perhaps the most important intervention of organizations like the Young Lords came in the realm of ideas, which they disseminated through their public meetings, through their radio program on WBAI, and their newspaper, Palante. And I want to give you a sense, these are photographs of the Young Lords. Here, the community education, which they deemed critical to the advancement of ideas that challenge this war on poverty argument, which was popularized by the Moynihan Report. And here is a photograph of Richie Perez putting together the newspaper Palante. At a moment when culture of poverty arguments were dominant, the Young Lords argued vehemently that the problems afflicting Puerto Ricans and African Americans were not cultural, but structural and beyond the control of these two groups. And this is important to underscore at a moment when a film like Precious, right, which totally uses these very powerful arguments about culture of poverty, is so popular. The Young Lords pointed to the ways in which sectors of their community were becoming redundant and therefore dispensable as a result of automation, and argued that capitalism was to blame for the problems confronting both communities. In many ways, the Young Lords' apocalyptic depictions of what they deemed the economic and social dispensability of people of color under post-industrial capitalism foreshadowed later discussions of the end of the American dream when deindustrialization finally hit white America in the 1980s. In many ways, organizations like the Young Lords and the Black Panthers were amongst the first to identify and fight back against what sociologists now call the urban crisis. The Young Lords who joined the Young Lords in New York were also propelled to action by their experience in New York City's public schools in the late 1950s and early 1960s, at a time when white hostility to public school education was at an all-time high. And here I want to underscore this story, this very local story. In many ways, the problem with schools in New York is identified by the New York Young Lords, much like urban renewal is identified in Chicago by the Chicago Young Lords as being the centerpiece of the angst and radicalization of their generation. Members of the organization, like Denise Oliver, Richie Perez, Gloria Gonzalez, Felipe Luciano, Pablo Guzman, and many others, describe the impact of the Ocean Hill-Brownsville struggle on their consciousness. And this is actually a story that Mickey Melendez, who's here, was integral to, in part because a professor at Old Westbury encouraged these young Puerto Ricans to get involved in the Ocean Hill-Brownsville struggle. Some recall the experience of being physically assaulted by whites while being bused to schools in Queens and Brooklyn, an experience that, quote, changed many of them forever. These stories are corroborated by countless news articles that describe the protests against integration led by thousands of white parents in New York in the late 50s and early 60s. And this is a photograph. This is a history that really has been forgotten in New York and in American society of white reaction to integration, not in the South, but right here in the North. And Puerto Ricans and African Americans really were the victims of that white backlash. This is an article in the New York Times and a picture of the more than 10,000 white parents who march in protests of school integration, which was called school pairing. One of the Young Lords states on this issue, that, quote, the racialization in the schools at that time was palpable. White students were privileged, Black and Puerto Rican students were seen as deficient. Another Lord expressed that to be Puerto Rican and in the public school system engendered an existential crisis that he could not put his finger on, and that existential crisis often was turned inward until he joined the Young Lords. The story of white resistance to integration in the North and its impact on the radicalization of young people like the Young Lords is one of the least understood stories of the Northern movements, in part because we associate this narrative of white reaction with Southern struggles. Never do we imagine that this kind of reaction to integration was happening in the North. In many ways, locally, the nationalist orientation of organizations like the Young Lords was fueled by white backlash, but also by the demographic changes taking place in American cities. The increased racial segregation of American cities after World War II, produced by white flight to the suburbs and to the city's periphery, combined with deindustrialization, led to the increasing social isolation of Black and Puerto Rican communities. And this reality, in part, fostered the nationalism of the period. Theoretically and politically, the Young Lords coalesced on the basis of race and ethnicity, reflecting the residual racial ideology of the old racial structures in America. However, on the ground, the Young Lords were a harbinger of things to come. The group reflected the diverse racial and ethnic makeup of the postmodern city, of which Los Angeles today is the best example. Despite its largely Puerto Rican membership and professed Puerto Rican nationalism, African Americans made up about 25% of the Young Lords membership. And other Latinos, such as Cubans, Dominicans, Mexicans, Panamanians, and Colombians, claimed membership in the organization. And here, this is another photograph of that demonstration in 1964, March 13th, 1964. Just these are photographs that really give you a sense of the complicated ethnic and racial character of the organization. This, we might think, is a member of the Black Panther Party, but he, in fact, was a member of the Young Lords. Was this Montu? Jaja. So these pictures really give you a sense of the racial complexity of the organization. This diversity reflected the demographic shift in American cities propelled by the large waves of immigration triggered by post-war economic restructuring, decolonization movements, and Cold War conflicts in the Third World. And finally, by the Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1965 that eliminated racially discriminatory immigration policies in the U.S. The history of the Young Lords is a telling example of the underdocumented phenomenon of cross-racial and ethnic membership in nationalist organizations. This reality suggests that revolutionary nationalist groups were not always homogeneous entities, as is commonly understood. For example, while we do not have corresponding statistics for the Black Panther Party, we have abundant anecdotal evidence that many Latinos claimed membership in that organization. The seeming contradiction between the Young Lords' professed nationalism and its ethnic diversity is an indication of the porousness of nationalism in this changing urban context. It's also an indication of the dynamism of the organization and of its class politics. What is impressive about the ethnic diversity of the organization's membership is that non-Puerto Rican members were integral to the organization's lifeblood. Denise Oliver, who's portrayed here, was an African American and the first woman elected to the Young Lords leadership body. And Omar Lopez, the major strategist of the Chicago Young Lords, was also not Puerto Rican, but Mexican American. And that cross-fertilization, ethnic fertilization, was as much experienced in Chicago as it was in New York. African Americans who joined were certainly influenced by the fact that its leadership body was composed in part of two Black Puerto Ricans, Felipe Luciano and Juan F. Ortiz, and an Afro-Cubano, Pablo Guzman. And here's a photograph taken by Hiram Maristani, who's with us today, of the five who launched the formation of the Young Lords. And you can see that three of the members are Afro-Latino. In many ways, that reality is going to attract African Americans to the organization. With a formal leadership in New York largely composed of Afro-Latinos and with 25% of its membership comprised of African Americans, the Young Lords launched one of the first Latino political formations that identified with the Black Power movement and saw itself as part of the African diaspora. As such, the Young Lords exposed the different forms of racism within the Puerto Rican community and challenged its internalized forms. And I think that Daryl did a nice job in actually delving into the organization's racial politics. They explained racism within the Puerto Rican community as a byproduct of Spanish conquest, Native American genocide, African slavery, and very importantly, American imperialism. And here is an article that appears in Palante about racism. They denounced the use of common sense ideas and language that designated woolly hair as pelo malo and fine hair as pelo bueno, the good hair, bad hair dichotomy that many of us are familiar with. They were among a generation of Puerto Ricans who began the job of theorizing race in Latin American history, language, and society, a subject that is increasingly popular today in the field of Latino and Latin American studies. And their close affiliation with the Black Panther Party, the most persecuted black revolutionary organization of the 1960s, is testament to the kind of cross-ethnic and cross-racial solidarity that the 1960s produced, and challenges popular notions about the perennial character of the Black-Latino divide. The hybridity of the experience between blacks and Puerto Ricans was anchored materially in their shared condition as racialized and colonial subjects. African Americans were also drawn to the Young Lords because the issues around which the Young Lords organized affected poor African Americans too. And we know what those issues are: childhood hunger, lead poisoning, poor housing, schooling, and health care, and police brutality. And these are some of the images that you're probably familiar with. This is the garbage demonstration. Here's a photograph of their campaigns, door-to-door campaigns, testing children for lead poisoning and the Puerto Rican community for tuberculosis. Here is, fascinatingly enough, the 10-point health program of the Young Lords with Obama, which Obama could actually take a note from. And, you know, this is the continued health programs of the Young Lords, their breakfast programs, clothing drives. Here's a picture of Richie Perez at Harlem Hospital, arguing not just for better care for the community, but also for workplace issues, better conditions and wages for the workers. And here, of course, we have that they want a socialist society, which is point 13 of their 13-point program. But what else accounts for the Young Lords' deep sense of unity and solidarity with African Americans? Before finding widespread expression in the 1960s, the common currents between African Americans and Puerto Ricans were expressed in music, as they for decades worked, studied, and created alongside each other despite their differences. As noted by sociologist and cultural theorist Juan Gonzalez, quote, African Americans and Puerto Ricans in New York had been partying together for many years, unquote, since the musical revolution of the late 1940s, when musical giants like Mario Bauza, Machito, and Dizzy Gillespie joined forces in the creation of Cubop, or Latin jazz. It was on the dance floor that the experience of a generation of blacks and Puerto Ricans, reared in a moment of racial struggle and solidarity, gave shape to the Boogaloo, which combined R&B and soul traditions with Afro-Cuban musical idioms. And actually, the Boogaloo is understood to be the music of the Young Lords of that period. The Boogaloo became hugely popular among both groups, African Americans and Puerto Ricans, with Joe Cuba's Bang Bang and Pete Rodriguez's I Like It Like That. Speaking of the cultural hybridity of that period, Felipe Luciano observes the following, quote, the relationship that Puerto Ricans developed with black people were so deep and so loving and so contradictory and so enmeshed that it developed a new culture, and you could hear it in the music. Blacks and Puerto Ricans in New York, when you say the word, it already connotes a whole experience. And when he said that, when I was interviewing, I immediately remembered a photograph in which Malcolm X is speaking to an audience in Harlem, and in the back, you probably have noticed it, that it says something about Negroes and Puerto Ricans unite. The Young Lords and many others of their time fought to transform these common currents, which were inconsistent, into a conscious political principle of ethnic and racial solidarity. The history of the Young Lords suggests that even though the story of the 60s is told in black and white, By the mid-60s, the movements and its members reflected the multiracial and multi-ethnic character of American cities. The history of the Young Lords provides a compelling opportunity for narrating the history of social movements alongside the history of political economy. In the history of the Young Lords, we find many of the demographic, structural, and political forces that transformed American cities in the period after World War II and beyond. These include the beginnings of deindustrialization, the growth of racially diverse urban populations, and the struggle for power within these new contexts. There is a lot that can be concluded about this age of great dreams during which ordinary people took the reins of history in their own hands. One of the most important contributions of radicals was that they helped alter the terms of political debate in America. And that is a calling and obligation that we must continue to carry forth today, given the very important debates that are gripping American society, from issues of health care, the continued racism through incarceration that so many of us in our communities are suffering, but also continued war, which, as you know, the people of this generation said that a society that professes to be democratic should probably abandon imperialist wars. Thank you.
Well, first, I want to say sincerely that, that even though people like us who are professors and public speakers and writers, we live out of telling stories. As my friend Pedro Rivera used to say, vivimos del cuento, from storytelling. This engagement is very daring and very special because the Young Lords are something. It's a history. It's part of our legacy that have a special place in my heart and mind and in my tradition as a Puerto Rican, as a radical, and as something that is kicking and alive for us today. So I want to thank the committee for inviting for this gathering, and I think that it's working well, the combination, because I'm going to concentrate less on what happened, the story of the Young Lords. More on what I call the politics of memory. What is the meaning of the Young Lords today? I mean, how I interpret the way in which we remember the Young Lords and what they are leaving to us, what that means for us today. And this is taken from what you just said at the end, Howard, what that means in terms of redefining the terms of political debate in the United States. So I call this Americans' Rise to the Heart of Global Struggles, the Young Lords in World Historical Perspective. And I want to do like a counterpoint of two world historical conjunctures. And by that I mean two moments, critical moments in current history, the 1960s and 70s and what's happening today. The first point I call Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans in World Historical Perspective, and to place the Young Lords as the other Johanna and Darnell did very clearly in a specific moment, which is the late 60s and early 70s, which is the heyday, is the most radical moment of that conjuncture that you can trace from the 1955, the beginning, from Rosa Parks and Bandung. If you see it in a global way, from the beginning of the Black Freedom Movement in the United States, and a critical moment of decolonization in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, which is the larger historical context in which all of this happened. The maturation in the U.S. cities of a specifically radical movement, which is being called Black Revolution, revolutionary nationalism, third world left, etc. I mean, it's just a moment of black power, of the Black Panthers, of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit, of a specific kind of urban radicalism that have its particular kind of political definition. And in that context, in that historical context, this is also the heyday of Puerto Rican revolutionary nationalism, both in the island and in the U.S. And I think that interaction between the island and the U.S. is very important to understand the young lords, and as they used to say in the slogan, "Tengo Puerto Rico en mi corazón." No, so the Puerto Rican movement here and there is a very important reference, and how that there is a constellation, what Andy called the Puerto Rican movement. There is a constellation of movement. The Puerto Rican Solidarity Committee, the March to the UN in 1974, and there is a specific definition of Puerto Rican politics. It's perhaps the only moment, special moment, in which there is a close relationship between independence and socialism in Puerto Rico, which is one of the largest questions that we have in Puerto Rican politics, and how Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican movements emerge in that moment as key actors in international politics. That the Puerto Rican question is not at this moment. And Puerto Rico, as being the main colony at the moment of the beginning of the crisis of U.S. hegemony, have a particular kind of global projection. And within that general context, the Young Lords being one of the most visible and important movement in that inscription of Puerto Rico in that world historical conjuncture, articulating a politics that is against colonialism, both in the U.S. and Puerto Rico, and the whole discourse of internal colonialism that is being used in that moment. It's colonialism in the island, but Puerto Rican confronting colonial conditions in the U.S. Is an anti-imperialism against capitalism, racism, and patriarchy at the same time. And this intersectionality of the discourse, which is actually unique, it makes it one of the most powerful, radical political agendas in that period of time, including questions of gender and sexuality, and in a very dynamic way how that emerged within the Young Lords as a movement. And this being using the language of today that people like Grossfogel and I use, this is like articulating all the axes of the coloniality of power. You know, imperialism, racism, patriarchy, and capitalism at the center of their theory, because that is the theory of the Young Lords, and which is informing their politics. And that, I mean, the strength and power of that movement, having as a consequence what I call Americans rising to the heart of global struggles in that very same moment. And here I invoking the concept of Americans or diasporicans of Tato Laviera, poet Tato Laviera and Mariposa. To highlight on the one hand, the specificity of location struggles and social movements of Puerto Ricans in the U.S. And very often when we talk about the Young Lords, we're talking about New York, about the Northeast. That is also the Chicago connection, but is largely a U.S. urban movement. But it's also a movement that express that what some of us what I call Puerto Ricans as a translocal people. As a translocal people, and I will say as a racialized peoplehood. And the whole issue of racial discourse and connection with African Americans is very important also, but within the context of that definition of peoplehood, which actually articulates race, nationality, and ethnicity in complex ways, as I think that you are there representing in your presentation. And that then informing a specific political movement, specific social movement that have a particular kind of ideology and praxis, which is what I call U.S. vernacular urban revolutionary nationalism, that shared with the Black Panthers, with the Brown Berets, and that I think that you brilliantly actually put it in context with great clarity, Johanna. And there are a few things that I want to say about that. First is the claim of peoplehood. And why is nationalism? A claim of peoplehood, national identity against the denial of identity that is coming with colonialism. And I mean, Fanon is really important here. And an ideology of self-determination, which comes way beyond the rhetorical way in which self-determination is understood. It's really autogestión. It's very grounded in community, in everyday life, in alternative institutions. A politics that is that is anti-imperialist in very concrete ways. It's anti-war, and the question of war today and the legacy of the Young Lords is key. And a very clearly fledged politics of decolonization. And what is the meaning of decolonization for Puerto Ricans today is a question that we have to ask in very concrete ways. Recasting marginalized histories, cultural expression, knowledge, movement, and how it's actually is part and parcel of a very important movement that we, in our research and in our recasting radical memories, have to work, like the Puerto Rican Student Union, and how the movement for Puerto Rican studies, that the Young Lords and all of the Puerto Rican movement in that period is behind it, no? And how we are here because of that movement. Also, that is a movement of young people as key historical actors. And the emergence of the category of youth that later was partly converted into a category for governmental and private funding. But youth as a historical actor that presides a social movement, because it's a movement of young people also. And how is explicitly and clearly, and that point 13, a movement against capitalism, and for a more egalitarian system of life, that could be called socialism, but could also be called revolutionary intercommunalism in the language of Huey Newton. And that part of what Laura Pulido called a third world left, that is conceived on the one hand, is very grounded and conceived within the U.S., but it's also conceived as part of a much larger project of tricontinentalism, of decolonization, of national liberation beyond what's happening in the U.S. Against the triad of racism, colonialism, and capitalism. What for? I mean, what are the concrete ways in which this is manifested? The ideology of community control, the idea of community control, as having our own institutions, those institutions that were showed by Johanna, we all know. The idea to serve the people and the development of their own political language, the concept of community, power to the people. I putting these notes together, I was remembering Ricci, that always, until the end of his life, talk about power to the people. What is the meaning of that? I mean, what is the concrete meaning of, in terms of what kind of political agenda are we advancing through that kind of language? To have our own institution of self-determination, autogestión, like the People's Church, the breakfast program, the alternative schooling, the child care, and the health care. Cultural institutions also, which I think is something that we haven't researched enough. I was talking with Mickey about that. On the one hand, the cultivation of cultural traditions have been devalued and marginalized by the cultures of colonialism in the U.S. and in Puerto Rico, but at the same time, building a culture of liberation against sexism and homophobia, and remaking Puerto Rican culture against Puerto Rican racism, for instance. And one of the questions here is that for reflection is that there is
a way to engage the state in which there is demand of quality state services without dependence and clientelism from the state, which is distinct from the welfare state on the one hand, paternalism, on the other hand is distinct from neoliberal self-help. So there is a kind of political agenda that is distinct from what happened later also. That I think is a matter of reflection for us. And all of this is what I call a grounded radical politics and a broad-based politics of alliance. Should not forget that the Rainbow Coalition, the idea of the Rainbow Coalition that was colonized by Jesse Jackson later, is coming from Chacha Jimenez and Fred Hampton when they are in jail in Chicago. And a critical question in relationship to this that remains largely unanswered is it's a question of reform and revolution that Andy asked at the beginning. And one of the ways of formulating is how for movements to maintain autonomy at the same time that they relate to the state. The third point, which I'm going to close with this, is what I call resources of hope, the politics of memory and the current crisis. And some years ago, I wrote an article called Resources of Hope, Imagining the Young Lords and the Politics of Memory. And that's a thought from, it's a formulation from Raymond Williams, Resources of Hope. And my point here is that the legacy of the Young Lords is leaving to us resources of hope because of their example, because of the way that the theory and praxis that they left to us. There is a point here of reflection, which is why the decline of the wave of anti-systemic movement of the 1970s. Because we are, I will argue, in another wave of anti-systemic movement, and by that I mean social movements that have the ability to challenge and transform the global order, local conditions of life of people and the global order, and that's what I call anti-systemic movement. And this move from the global crisis to neoliberalism is the decline of the Puerto Rican movement in general, and what is left from the Young Lords. And there are a few things that are very clear. On the one hand, what we can call political capital. When you see the film of the Young Lords, you see all the people who were, so to say, trained, cadre, who was trained through all of that process and who are with us today. When I hear Juan Gonzalez every day in Democracy Now!, I say, well, this is the school of the Young Lords that is still with us. I mean, we have Iris here, we have Mickey and many other people. The ideology of Latinidad, a radical ideology of Latinidad, I mean, reflecting on Latino studies today, the concept of Latinidad is coined in that kind of radical U.S. way. Is coined in that context, and the legacy of a U.S. third world radical politics that connect our conditions of oppression here to what's happening in the so-called developing countries in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. The concrete tangible victories such as the against lead painting, the Lincoln Hospital survival, and things that are tangible victories that are there, results. And the memory of collective action and a politics of hope, of pride and of inspiration and examples to follow. So, in the current world historical conjuncture that we're living today, in the current moment that we're living today, I will argue that we're living a moment that is very similar to the moment of the late 1960s, early 1970s. I mean, it's a moment of crisis, but this time it's terminal of U.S. hegemony. I mean, I will say that what happened yesterday with Obama, declaration of war, is an act of desperation. It's an act of not having any more possibilities of trying to recuperate a U.S. hegemony that is lost forever. I will call this a civilizational crisis. And a crisis is an untenable situation where there is an imperative to change. Obama won for many reasons, but one of them was the overwhelming message of the need to change. And a moment of crisis is a moment of suffering and risk, but it's also a moment of opportunity. The crisis is diverse, it's economic, as we all know, but it's an ecological crisis. It's a food and hunger crisis. It's a crisis of legitimacy and functionality of the liberal state, or the liberal democratic state. Such the endurance of Guantanamo and a state of permanent war, which goes beyond any administration, I think are the clear symptoms of the crisis in which we're living today. But it's at the same time a colonial crisis in Puerto Rico. Now, we know that there was in Puerto Rico a month or so ago a one-day strike, and that there is literally a bankruptcy of the colonial state in Puerto Rico, and the failure of the original miracle of the post-World War II developmentalism, both in Puerto Rico and the U.S., because this idea that Puerto Rico is going to be the showcase of democracy and of development for the rest of the world was for Puerto Rico the island. No, the Puerto Rican model that was the original miracle of developmentalism is the definite failure of that project in Puerto Rico. But the fact that Puerto Ricans in the U.S. still have the worst indications, as Johanna was saying, in terms of inequality, is the other side of the coin of why there is a failure of the colonial experiment in Puerto Rico. So it's a colonial crisis. And in that sense, the politics, the theory and politics of the young lords is actually paradigmatic, and it is prophetic of what's happening today. I think it's terribly current to the situation in which we're living today. But it's also a crisis of alternatives. No, what to do that will take us to a better condition. No, what to do, and you know, this is one of the greatest challenges that we have. And in that context, I will argue that rescuing the memory of the young lord's radical vision and transformative politics is important for breaking the impasse for Puerto Rican politics here and there, and to frame it again as an important component of what I will call the new politics of decolonization and liberation. And what is this new politics of decolonization and liberation in this current context of anti-systemic movement? In a book that was published recently called Utopia Reborn about Latin America, there is this argument that many people throughout the world are actually launching today, is that Latin America is one of the main axes of hope. I mean, like, going against this idea of Bush that Chavez, for example, is the axis of evil, that is the idea of the axis of hope. So this axis of hope in the world, it's a very important reference that is directly related to the legacy of the young lords and the kind of memory that we have in relation to them today. In the Latin American region, as you know, today most countries have some sort of progressive governments. The Black and indigenous movements, for example, across the region are launching a politics of decolonization, of power and decolonization of knowledge. Evo Morales, the first indigenous president in Bolivia, is talking about the decolonization of state, economy, and education. In the U.S. Social Forum, which actually I am an activist in the World Social Forum, and the U.S. Social Forum was the one in which there was more representation of people of color. No, it was mostly the new working class. And who is the new working class in the people? People of color, immigrants, women. Organizations like Project South, like New Orleans, organizations which are connecting black movements in the U.S. with black movements in Latin America. And there has been a shift of black radicalism from north to south, I would say, in the Americas. Unlike the Young Lords, there is, in this new politics of decolonization and liberation, a struggle against multiple oppressions, intersectionality, against class, race, gender, and sexual oppressions. Now we should also add the ecological component of this, and against white Eurocentric education, and struggles which are grounded in working class communities of people of color, in actual grassroots politics. But to close, this is not necessarily how we tend to remember the legacy of the Young Lords. And I will say that there are dangers of sanitizing or domesticating our memory of the Young Lords, and to dispossess it from its radical, in the sense of going to the roots, transformative edge. Some issues that I think we should look into. The first one is glorification without critical analysis of the positive and negative lessons. For instance, the question of the state, the question of reform and revolution. And a possible solution to that question, I will say, is the idea, which I think is really much related to what Young Lords are doing, of developing on the ground and dynamically radical reforms that constitute radical challenges and advances in empowerment. But also the problem of the authoritarian political culture that curtail the radical democratic practice in the Young Lord organization. So we also have to be critical of the Young Lord and see the problems. And we haven't done enough in terms of that, because it's such a powerful experience that we haven't been taking some critical distance to see the problems in the Young Lords as a social movement. There is the issue of not evaluating enough what the theory and practice of the Young Lords had to say to our analysis of current conjunctures and our politics today. And I will close by saying that there is the need to explore how the radical vision and transformative politics of the Young Lords organization can constitute resources of hope to inform and inspire rearticulating Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans in the new politics of decolonization and liberation, and in the renaissance of social movement politics in Puerto Rico and in the United States. The renaissance of social movement politics, of collective action, of politics grounded in the real conditions of everyday life, of communities of working class people of color, with a transformative vision. I think that is the most important legacy that we have from the Young Lords. Thank you.
Thank you, Augustín. Thank you, Johanna. Thank you, Darrell. Good stuff, right? Okay, so some quick announcements before we move to the next part of our agenda, which I urge you to hang on for, because we're not finished by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, quickly. There is a handout describing what exactly is entailed when you make a donation to the Centro archives, collections, and so forth. Make sure you have that. It gives a general picture in terms of those kinds of donations that you might be interested in making, and connecting with our library archive staff. Tomorrow, here at Hunter College, kind of in certain continuity with tonight's event, Centro Library initiates a new art exhibit sponsored by, curated by one of our own faculty here, Milagros Denis, professor in the Africana, Puerto Rican, Latino Studies Department. And the title of the exhibit is Asserting Their Rights, Puerto Ricans and African Americans in Their Quest for Social Justice. There is a reception that begins at 6 o'clock tomorrow evening. You're all welcome. Please check that out. We have another event, an interesting book release event that is taking place next Tuesday. The new book is entitled Barrio Professors by a very distinguished social scientist, Dr. Lloyd Rogler, talks about his years working in Puerto Rico as a mental health worker. It's been out for about 6 months, and I assure you it's very interesting reading, and you get a chance to see the author and talk about the book as well. Next Friday, Centro is sponsoring an all-day forum open to everyone here. The title is Pathways to Economic Opportunities, Puerto Ricans in Low-Wage Jobs and Labor Markets. It's going to be held at the Hunter College School of Social Work all day next Friday. There's a leaflet about it, and always you can come to our website for all updates and information about our various events. I want to ask our special guest tonight, speaking on behalf of the committee on the community side that helped coordinate this whole event tonight. I'm going to ask him to come up, say a few words. Miguel Melendez from the committee.
Good evening. Before I begin, I'd like to invite those that were young lords to please come up here. I did see a couple. Cleo Silvers is in the audience. Okay, some of the people still want to be married. Okay, just a moment. Can I get the proclamation?
There's Sean.
On behalf of the Planning Committee, we haven't seen each other in a while. On behalf of the Planning Committee, I'd like to thank Andrés Torres. I think it was a pleasure working with you. It's been about 6 months that we've been putting this project together. For each of the panelists for bringing your own unique perspective. It was very interesting, and I'd like to thank you. The text, expanded versions, including Marta's, will hopefully be available at the Centro Journal, a special edition on the Young Lords, and hopefully will include some of Hiram Maristani's photos. So that's going to be available. Just to set a couple of things straight, the voiceover that you heard that Johanna referred to as Luis Garnacosta is actually the voice of the late Eddie Figueroa, who was our bridge and one of the founders of the New York movement. The professor at Old Westbury that we had, the only professor of color when the State University of Old Westbury opened up, is Carlos Russell, still living in Brooklyn, a black Panamanian. And when they refer to the riots, is Milton Ayala still here? When they refer to the riots of East Harlem in 1967, one person was charged with 32 counts, and I'd like to acknowledge Milton Ayala. He was a young lord before the young lords got to El Barrio. We heard a lot about history. I'd just like to talk about 3 things that are present and current. I'd like you to keep your ears open to it, and please show your bodies in support. One is the general strike that's being organized in Puerto Rico in response to the economic crisis, I think sometime in February. We're going to be having demonstrations here in support of that. As pointed out on August 23rd by Panama, the Puerto Rican Latino movement has been the only movement in the United States that has freed their political prisoners on 2 occasions. Our work is not done. We still have 3 Puerto Rican political prisoners, and we have 5 Cubans to get out of jail. So please keep in tune to that. I'd like to call up front the people that, the archive people. Is Juan Pedro here? Oh, Pedro Wang? Pedro Wang, is any of the staff from downstairs? Okay. This wasn't found in an attic, and it wasn't in a basement. We just kind of recently got it. And I don't know what that piece of paper says about protocol or following that stuff, but this is kind of the Young Lord way of doing things. On October 14th, there was a proclamation given to the Young Lords, and the way we feel is that no one Young Lord should have this in their possession. And we want to give it to a Centro so that they can have it on display. So I'd also like to thank Melissa Mark Viverito, Rosie Mendez, and Charles Barron for their... Thank you.
Are you going to tell us about the proclamation?
Oh, we had it on display. There's a lot of text, or get in touch with the Centro to see when they're going to put it on display. There's just a lot of text there. Anyway, it's very...
All right, so one final kind of gracias to folks. As always, you know, Centro staff is behind the scene pulling off these kind of things. In the last few weeks, helping us big time was Rosalie Roman. Rosalie, raise your hand. And I also want to thank Hiram Maristani. Where are you, Hiram? For making available your materials. In the back, there is a nice little display. There's a rolling screen of images and other items related to the young Lord. So you can enjoy that after we do our next thing. So we have two folks up front, Yasmin and then Carlos back there, and we're going to alternate. So we're in the question and answer period. So let's process all of this that has been presented to us, and please, I know the presenters, we all would appreciate your thoughts, your comments, questions. So raise your hands, and we have a mic here.
Could someone address when and how they were disbanded?
Can someone address when and how they were disbanded? It can be someone of historical authority, or it can be someone on the panel who has studied this historically. Oh, we have someone indeed of authority. Iris Morales in the back.
It's too long a story, so I'll give you a very brief version. Most everything that people talk about in terms of the Young Lords is the very early period. But in fact, the Young Lords had various stages of development. And there was the first period, so if you think about it like a roller coaster, most of it that we talk about is up to the point on the top of the roller coaster. And we don't talk to the way down. And which, as Augustín said, for what's happening today, it's very important for us to know both what the strengths were of the movement and then what caused the decline of the movement, because we are in a very significant historical moment. All of the conversation that the distinguished panelists gave us, which felt a little weird actually to be kind of talked about in theoretical terms, but that to the side. I followed most of it, guys. All of that came to a head. The organization was very vibrant in terms of its theoretical and ideological influences. So in the early part, there was revolutionary nationalism, there was feminism, there was socialism, there was a struggle against colonialism, and at different points in the organization's history, I did say this was going to be short. I'm sorry. When a young lord says they're going to be short, don't believe it. But anyway, at a certain point, the organization made a choice to go to Puerto Rico. At another point, the organization made a choice to close those branches in Puerto Rico and to join with an effort to build a revolutionary party in the United States. In that motion, which was tied into what was happening within the United States and within the world to destroy social movements, in that motion, the Young Lords became actually cannibalistic internally, adopting ideologies and becoming more and more sectarian and more removed from the community and the strength that Augustín talked about, which was the organizing in the community. That was our strength. And when we lost that, combined with all of this, and we haven't all summed this up together, so I will say that this is my analysis. We have other young lords in the audience that may want to address this point.
Okay, we're going to take a question now from the back.
Yeah, I am a young lord, but I'm really going to be short. I had a question that I wanted to raise with our panel, and that is, have you considered the discussion of the role of COINTELPRO and governmental forces that also impacted on the demise of the Young Lords and other organizations during that period?
This is related to the comments made by Edie's, whom I didn't know was here, and the question of what happened to the organization. I try to address some of that in my doctoral thesis, but it's a complex history. But in thinking about my comments for today, and I think I need to stand up. In thinking about my comments for today, and in teaching the history of the Vietnam War, which I happen to be teaching right now at Baruch this week, it became clear to me that Puerto Rico was the single most important political possession of the United States in the late 60s, when they were losing big time to a raggedy-ass little third-rate nation called Vietnam, which is what Johnson called Vietnam. So the stakes were incredibly high. American hegemony was challenged and exposed, and Puerto Ricans in New York who were mainland-born, but also the broader Puerto Rican movement was talking about Puerto Rican liberation. For the United States to have lost Puerto Rico after having lost Vietnam would have meant a disaster of political proportions. When the Young Lords decided to go to Puerto Rico, the kind of repression that ensued was enormous, and it's understudied. I happen to have now acquired over 2,000 documents on the Young Lords. And initially, my understanding was that the Black Panthers suffered more political repression than the Young Lords, which allowed the Young Lords to do their thing in New York and Chicago. Well, that's certainly not true. What's fascinating about the New York Lords is that they emerged under the reign of a liberal Republican, which is a contradiction in terms, Lindsay. The Young Lords in Chicago were under enormous repression by the Red Squad from the get-go because they had to evolve under the leadership of Mayor Daley, a gangster. essentially. But part of what, some of the documents that I found just recently, I got not from El Centro, but from the FBI. I just happened to have gotten a cache of these documents. The amount of repression and surveillance that the young lords experienced is documented in part in these documents. But part of what I want to just stress, I don't think surveillance alone led to the decline of the young lords. Some suggest. Some academics suggest that the politics of organizations like the Young Lords and the Black Panthers, which sought to organize the most marginalized people in society, actually opened up these organizations to repression, because the most marginalized people in society are also often more likely to fall out of discipline and be wooed by organizations like COINTELPRO. So repression had a lot to do with the decline of the organization. But most importantly, the centrality of Puerto Rico to American hegemony when the United States was losing to Vietnam was critical. And it's something that I only now really am beginning to understand. And it wasn't only the Young Lords that suffered this repression. I know that El Centro is accumulating these thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of surveillance of the Puerto Rican left, of the Puerto Rican movement.
Yasmin, or do we have some? Right up here.
My name is Carlos Aponte, and I was involved as an educator within the Young Lords and an organizer. I have a proposal for the proposal type question for the panel, which I think is a tremendous job in opening up this issue of study and bringing it current. And my proposal is that research, especially academic research, that looks at a phenomenon like this 40 years ago, can sometimes focus so much on aspects of it that are the most prominent, the most written about, or the aspects of that experience which is most in the memory of folks. So when you do oral histories, for instance, you find that people will talk more about what they remember the most. And as we know, memory changes every year as it goes by. You rewrite your history the older you get. So we're talking about baby boomers here, my generation, who, along with Mickey and other people who have less hair now than we did in the pictures that you saw, we're not always reliable resources for what happened. So I would propose that you consider, as part of the, not just in the Centro, but just as the movement of research that is very important, that is undertaken, that we're looked at what we did in very many different levels of experience. Because what we've talked about here are the big question dimensions of what we did. All the issues of, all the isms, of course. Racism, nationalism, colonialism, or community organizing, the movement for integration and disintegration of school systems, etc. But there were other levels which I'm not going to go into right now, but the one that I'd like to just propose to you as my particular pet issue is how what we did affected personal transformation. And that has been the driving force of my life ever since this young lady sitting to my side admonished me and scolded me before I joined the Young Lords when I started my community organizing on the Lower East Side. And she told me back then in 1968 that I should not give people the products of my thinking, but that I should help others to develop the products of their own thinking. Because that's the essence of decolonization, helping people to generate their own thoughts as opposed to telling them what their problems are. And one of the things that has struck me the most as time has gone on, especially in the first 10 years after the Lords, I would meet people constantly who would say, Carlos, thank you so much for changing my life. And I'd be saying to myself, who is this person? And they'd remind me of a rally that I went to, or a high school that I went to, or part of what we used to call the, in the Bronx branch, which Richie and I started, we used to call it the baby daycare center, because so many of our members in the Bronx were preteens or teenagers. I mean, large amounts of our members were students, college dropouts like myself and Mickey, or college, current college students like 80s. But a lot of our kids were very, very young. So part of our work was, how do we develop thinking, not just cadres that sell newspapers and can spout all the isms and can march and look beautiful with berets and red leather jackets and can march, but how can you develop people who can think, so that then later, as I would run into them, I would ask them, okay, so what are you doing now? People would then tell me about their experience. And what has struck me over these 40 years of those kinds of experience, including a little while ago when I ran into Louis Garden, who I hadn't seen in 40 years, and he reminded me that I organized him into the Young Lords in 1969, and I had totally forgotten that. And it was just in a conversation we had in a restaurant in Greenwich Village. The thing that strikes me the most about research today is that we don't think about revolutionary movements or social change movements in terms of how can individuals change their way of thinking in ways that are sustainable, so that they are generated in their life. I've met a lot of former Young Lords who are today professionals, whose personal professional life has nothing to do with the communities that they came from, with the kinds of issues that they generate. They're not active socially, they're not contributing to their communities, they're not back there. It doesn't mean that what they're doing is not valuable in one way or another to society, but they're not socially conscious and actively taking a piece of who they are and bringing it back to our community. So how today, in this world of texting and blogs and this world of meetups and this whole decentralized way of being, where it's no longer about, renting a room and throwing out a flyer, now it's the electronic age, how can we change this generation of young Puerto Ricans who don't speak Spanish, who don't have a memory of the island, who don't have the nuclear family, who don't have the community encasing that we had in El Barrio, or that we had in the South Bronx? That's no longer there. We're everywhere. We're now everywhere. We're alone in many ways. So how can we change people in such a way today, through this study, through this research, through the lessons learned? Edith is very, very right about saying that we probably can learn more about what we did wrong than by what we did right. For the message for young people today, for teenagers and people in their 20s and 30s, how can we transform individual ways of thinking so that we can sustain it, and it doesn't just become going to a meeting, attending a rally, or raising your fist in the air? Thank you.
Should we take another? Okay. I've asked, that we jump back and forth, so we will keep in mind these two here for the next. Do we have someone back there? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a couple of questions. First, I teach Latin American history and American history here at Hunter, and I just wanted to say that I think that the work of rescuing historical memory is crucial, and it is actually a weapon in struggle. And I was very glad that a few minutes ago somebody linked that work to the struggle to free the political prisoners and who are still in prison. And one of the people today who is fighting to rescue historical memory is Mumia Abu-Jamal, and we need to fight to free him now when his life is under a renewed attack. I wanted to ask a couple quick questions. The 40th anniversary of the Young Lords Party occurs at a time when we have a 40th anniversary of a huge struggle here at CUNY that won open admissions, that was a victory of the 1960s, that was subsequently taken away. And I wanted to see if people could address the links between those two struggles, between those two anniversaries, and the human links between people who became prominent in the Young Lords Party and those who were involved in the struggle that won open admissions at CUNY. And my other question is to Dr. Fernández, coming off of her extremely stimulating presentation. You talked about the ways in which arguments about a so-called culture of poverty were used to justify and provide an ideological cover for racial oppression in the period that gave rise to the Young Lords and to the Black Panther Party. And you linked some of the issues that you discussed in your presentation to questions of politics and society today. What kinds of echoes of those arguments about a so-called culture of poverty may we be seeing today, including from the Obama White House?
One of the most dominant ideas and most pernicious ideas that survived the 1960s was the idea that people of color, that African Americans and Puerto Ricans were somehow responsible for their condition, and it wasn't because of biology, right? But because of race, and because of culture, their cultural ways, single-headed households, and the inability of these people to be married in traditional ways, and that idea, which the Young Lords and the Black Panthers challenged in many ways, or the battle against those ideas was lost, and those ideas are single-handedly responsible for the dismantling of welfare in the 1990s. Someone mentioned the importance of fighting for radical reform in the context of capitalist society, demanding things from the state without actually submitting to the state. One of the fascinating things about the Young Lords in New York and their relationship with the administration, I had the opportunity to interview some people from the mayor's office. Someone who died recently, the author of New York in Crisis, Barry Goddard, who died. Some of you who were Lords might remember him. He was part of Mayor Lindsay's team and others. One of them actually told me recently that one of the reasons why the Young Lords didn't get beaten up as much by the cops is because every time they had a demonstration, she made sure, I don't know if this is true, she made sure to get a permit for you guys, to avoid the clash between the cops and the Young Lords. What Barry Goddard told me was that those Young Lords, we can buy them. They, in Lincoln Hospital, in the struggle over lead paint, we attempted in various ways to get them into the administration through money, essentially, by offering them cash. And of all of the groups that were active in New York, those damn kids, they wouldn't take the bait. So I'm going all over the place, but essentially, the Young Lords actually fought for welfare rights in New York, and they fought for reforms at the same time that they didn't make deals with the system, and they understood the importance of the transformation of the consciousness of Puerto Ricans and African Americans. And community education, which actually Iris Morales was pivotal in, was critical, and I think that question of community education is what transformed the lives of so many Young Lords. One of the fascinating things about the Young Lords is that they're autodidacts. The Young Lords and the Black Panthers educated people and turned them into erudite critics when the American school system in New York had pretty much given up on them. And that's one of the legacies. You know, we talk about it's important to criticize the Young Lords, and I think it is. And I think that this question of democratic centralism and how it operated in the organization is probably one of the areas that requires critique. But there is so much that the Young Lords did that the city of New York didn't, and continues not to do for New Yorkers. Just finally, Obama. You know, one of the problems with the Obama administration is that he continues to pay homage to this idea that we should pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and that he, you know, really did it on his own, which means that he has to castigate periodically on the down low the kids out there who are just no-count Negroes and Puerto Ricans who really have to get it together. And I think that certainly Obama tells the story of meritocracy. And the flip side of that story, which is pernicious, is that there's something wrong with the culture of these people, right? It doesn't actually take into account that when Puerto Ricans and African Americans came to New York in large numbers, the industrial base of the city, which had previously provided jobs to immigrants, was gone. So what meritocracy is there when these migrants actually had very little in terms of resources to help them move up in the society? Not to mention, of course, the problem of racism and colonization that they experienced like a ton of bricks. And just finally, I think this question of education in the schools, it's something that has come up over and over in my interviews with Young Lords. The schools failed this generation of Young Lords, and someone like Mickey Melendez mentioned to me in conversation a long time ago that lead poisoning is probably responsible for the low levels of education amongst sectors of African Americans and Puerto Ricans. The very structure of the city was falling apart, and it impacted these communities in ways so complex that we can't begin to fully address.
Right here. Yes. Oh. Okay. We got
Just a comment. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, members of El Comité did what was perhaps their first activity where they sort of reflected on their own experience, and it was a remarkable, and Carlos was there, it was a remarkable telling of the stories, and it began with really people doing exactly what I think you were talking about, you know, kind of reflecting on what it personally meant for them, and then they went into kind of everything else, including ending up with the problem of democratic centralism. Just to say that we focused a lot on the Lords, and the Lords did a lot of this really sort of heavy-duty media, you know, activities. But it's also that they're not in isolation, and I think it's important to also do, you know, some study of some of the other groups, and I think at Comité in particular, you know, which had a different kind of model of cadre formation, right? So, you know, I just think it needs to be expanded. I'm really glad all of this work is being done. And also, you know, the Nationalist Party, you know, and all the work that they had been doing, you know, kind of that's all in the Ruth Reynolds oral history, and they had organizations supporting Puerto Rican. Anyway, these things connect. And so it's just about, I don't want to see the Lords in isolation, because as a person who went through all of this movement, kind of close to people without being a member of either a Comité or the Young Lords, but my sister was in a Comité, you know, they really all had an impact, and they had a different kind of an impact. And there were important ways in which the Comité, more than I think other organizations, really connected to Puerto Rico and to Latin America, you know, in ways that were really absolutely, you know, significant. So just to expand your work.
Housing in El Comité is, the work of housing is just phenomenal. Yes.
Aquí. because she's had her hand up, and then we'll go to Joelle.
Okay.
I can project. I wrote my my master's thesis on the Young Lords, the history of the Young Lords, and as I look around, I feel in many respects that we are kind of preaching to the choir here, because I'm an American history major, and it was the most frustrating feeling that I could not find any information. We talked about the Lindsay. I'm talking about the Anglo media or the Anglo historians. You talk about Lindsay. You have Vincent Canano, the ungovernable city. Not one mention of the Young Lords. Howard Zinn, the liberal of liberals. Not one mention. And my question is, how do we mainstream this information? This is all wonderful that we're here and we're exchanging this information, but when the historians have not really accepted this organization as well as others, this is wonderful research. I mean, I wanted to write my dissertation, but you know what? It needs to be recognized, and it can't be, just for us. And it has to, go mainstream at some point. And how do you do that?
Quick answer to that?
Daryl.
I think one of the ways that you do that is you have to make the resources available to people outside of New York City and outside of people who have access to very specific kind of centers in New York City, right? I mean, the Centro has so many great resources. It's wonderful. I flew here multiple times from Indiana to do that research because I had to. But I mean, I think in terms of, if you're talking about the kind of broader impact in American history and sociology outside of New York City and Chicago, I think you have to make the resources available more broadly, and that's something that I'm doing in a book called The Young Lords Reader, or Young Lords a Reader, through NYU Press. So that's something that'll make those resources available, stuff from Palante, speeches that were given, etc. And hopefully that'll create more awareness of the Young Lords so that it does end up in American history books, and does end up in introductory sociology textbooks and introductory communication studies textbooks, right?
I will add one thing to that. I mean, I think that what you both doing is really important. I mean, publishing books, taking it out there, doing serious research. What the Young Lords have their own intellectuals, and this is one. I also felt a little bit awkward speaking about the Young Lords in a situation in which there are Young Lord intellectuals here. And actually, I purposely didn't prepare an academic paper and did more of a political intervention. I mean, I usually can prepare an academic paper, etc. And I decided not to do that because I thought it was more of a community gathering to reflect politically about the meaning of the Young Lords. But mainstreaming, is that a goal that we have? I mean, do we want to mainstream? What that means, mainstreaming, that's one question that I will throw back to you. The other issue is that it's an ongoing struggle. I mean, I was just talking with Eddie Teges before, sociologist who's here at Princeton, and about the further invisibilization of Puerto Ricans. I mean, Puerto Ricans were much more visible in the moment in which had that kind of importance to the U.S. empire that do not have now. And now it's more of a challenge, actually, to make more visible Puerto Rican studies at this point. And I think that we should start from that kind of understanding. That is a very difficult struggle. I mean, how are we going to make in the American Sociological Association and in U.S. history, Puerto Rican history, and the scholarship that we do in Puerto Rican history is not very easy. I mean, I actually got the other day an announcement that Frances Negron now is the director of the Center for Ethnic Studies at Columbia, and now you have Arlene Davila, for example, in NYU, and that's actually, I was very pleased about that, because historically, even in New York, it's, I mean, we have this initiative of the Centro of having more Puerto Rican professors at CUNY. Now we're sitting here in CUNY, and the Centro is here because of the historical struggles, and is still here because of that. So this is an ongoing, I mean, we had to see that colonialism is also, as we say, using a fancy word from the coloniality of power, epistemic colonialism, no? And the coloniality of knowledge is kicking and alive in the institutions, in the professional institutions, in the university in which we're working. So this is an ongoing struggle. I mean, I will say more than mainstreaming, to understand that this is part of the labor of decolonization that we have to do.
Great. Joel, back there.
My name is Alfonso Gonzalez. I teach at NYU Latino Studies. I'm a Chicano from Southern California. And I want to say thank you to all the young lords, because you left a very beautiful legacy that, you know, I have to agree with what people have said. The history of the young lords is not known. I did Latino Studies, the undergrad, master's program, PhD in political science, and studied Latino politics, and we never learned about the young lords in the West Coast. I had to come to the East Coast to learn about them, and I think that's unfortunate, because Chicanos, I think we have a lot to learn from the young lords, especially thinking about them in comparative perspective, because, you know, we had a very similar organization, which was the Brown Berets, that developed also in conjunction with the Black Power movement as well in East LA. Bunchy Carter was giving a talk in East Los at a cafe to a young church group that later became the Brown Berets. So there's very interesting histories there. They took on very different trajectories. The Brown Berets are still around today, because I agree with Augustín, we are in a moment of struggle, and it's the immigrant rights struggle which has become a Latino struggle for other Latino groups to be involved in. I think that has been something that's created the need for organization and militant, organized, disciplined work on the ground. And one of the interesting things about the immigrant rights movement is that we see a lot of Puerto Ricans in the immigrant rights movement, and that's an interesting place of sort of inter-Latino struggle, right? So my question for the panelists, maybe some of the lords, is is there young lords that have become active in the immigrant rights movement? I know, like in labor, there's people in 32BJ who are young lords and who are do labor involved in the immigrant rights movement. But what's been the trajectory of the the young lords with the immigrant rights movement? Thank you.
Anybody want to take that up?
Okay, go ahead. I just want to say, as an African American, I think that the immigrants' rights movement is at the center of what we need to be working on as people who were born here in this country, or the older immigrants. And that, for me, the work that I do now has to do with focusing on making health care available for immigrant workers who don't otherwise have health care. Especially if they're injured or have been exposed to toxic chemicals and things like that, which is what I do. But the focus of my work now is to make sure that the struggle to allow immigrant workers the same access as everyone else is like key. This is a key element of what we need to be doing.
One announcement that I want to make before we take one or two more questions, brought to my attention, interesting. You may have seen this on the internet. There is a film panel and reunion series entitled Panthers and Lords in Unity and Struggle at the Males Cinema, 127th, 128th Street. Leaflets, hope, are available, but check that out as well. Beginning tomorrow for a week-long series. Yes?
My name is Humberto, Panama. I just have two questions. One, I think the question of immigrant rights. I do work also on race relations in Latin America. I think the young lord experience, I think the fundamental question that you see the difference with the immigrants movement is a question of racism. Because I think the experience of the young lords, the experience of the brown, in that time, race was a factor in relation to building solidarity, a very important historical moment of a decomposition kind of U.S. apartheid. I mean, today, the new immigrants movement, even for Puerto Rico, I mean, Augustín and also do the work in also the region, the issue of racism, even in our country, have shifted. Where the census in various countries, the issue of what your identity is more white than Afro-descendant or African. So I think one of the fundamental strength of the young lords movement is they understood the connection between solidarity in different oppressed groups and the centrality of race and racism in this country. And I think that is missing in some of the movement today. You see in a lot of immigrants movement, serious racists and very ahistorical understanding of how the movement was built as a unified force. So I think that experience of the young lords, of how they handle racism and understanding the historical factor in the U.S. I think the second factor that I'm not sure that in the presentation I was listening to, and I say this for the Panamanians who were here in the same period, that Carlos Ross, so I could mention a whole bunch of Panamanians who were involved. I came later, but that what was the transition between people who were leadership at the movement about inclusion, who then became brokers of the system itself? How many of our people became, out of that poverty program, reproduce the system instead of oppressing the system? I think those are challenges, because I think in the immigrants' experience, inclusion, democratizing something, is also the question of you transforming it. And I think the whole question of transforming it is a challenging question. And I think we're facing it right now in our movement. And there's an ideological pressure to immigrants in America, different than in a lot of places, other countries you live. But in America, if you're going to transform this, you kind of have to own it, accept it in immigrants. And I would say to Johanna that also the question of Vietnam was important, but I would say that the Cuban experience was a determinant experience, because the U.S. after Cuba said nothing is going to change in this region, including the invasion after to the Dominican Republic and the approach to Panama later, is a containment of the acceptance of no radical movement in this country. And I would end saying that our movements also suffer that, say today, the kind of anti-communism that penetrated our movement and justified the persecution of a lot of people coming from society with socialist perspective, who were then, persecuted here.
Okay, we'll take one last question before the food goes cold on us.
Here.
One last question. Very good. Yes.
Thank you. I was just thinking about that photo that you showed with the 5 gentlemen who were writing and brought together the Young Lord organization. And I know they have some roots with being a turf gang in Chicago back in the 60s that I read about. And I was just wondering, how did people come to care about it? Like, how did it get into such an organized way? I know it might be complicated, but like, how did the intellectuals get involved? And it became like not just a street organization, but a political movement.
In Chicago?
In general, like Chicago, and then moving on to New York and expanding to other cities. Like, what are some of the things that the Young Lords did to get people to care about their movement or to get involved with them?
I think one of the key things that they did was that they were really truly a grassroots movement, and so the several lords tell the story of the garbage offensive, and kind of having organized prior to the garbage offensive and been talking about, well, what do we do? How do we get started? We've got all these ideas. Let's find out what's needed. Or what was needed was organizing around trash, because the garbage folks weren't picking up the trash in East Harlem. And that turned into a way to translate some of these theoretical ideas into praxis, right, into action. And I think that's one of the key things, to me at least, about the Young Lords and their legacy and their successes, was that they were so attuned to the needs of the community and addressing those needs, and in doing so in ways that that in my reading of it at least wasn't guided by like orthodox political ideology, but rather was guided by a kind of a assemblage of various ideas that they'd come into contact with, ranging from I think it's Guzman who says, we read everyone. We read, Thomas Jefferson and Fidel Castro and Che, and goes through this whole long list of folks that we would consider kind of part of the mainstream of political thought in the in an Anglo-United States, and also radical Latin American political folks. So to me that real strength is doing is those kind of that real kind of tangible community activism that then that they were able to translate some of these ideas. I think there was another photograph that was put up of the clothing drive, right, where it had the point number 13 that we want is socialist society, right, but then the sign next to it is clothing drive, right. This is a practical application of socialist ideas, and that kind of translation work is what made it palpable, I think.
To follow, to piggyback on that, I think that it's important to understand social movement as spaces of production of knowledge. And in the case of the Young Lords, how there is a very dynamic process of this grounded knowledge on grassroots conditions that produces its own intellectuals. I mean, that since that time until now, we have really important Puerto Rican intellectuals that were produced by that movement and by the Puerto Rican movement in general. I mean, we have Andy here as a Puerto Rican intellectual that was produced by another instance of that Puerto Rican movement of that moment. And that takes me to, when we talk about intellectuals, I think that the notion has been coined by some people about community intellectuals. I think it's really important, because to understand Puerto Rican studies is crucial, or Chicano studies for that sake. I mean, I remember when I met Bert Corona. Bert Corona didn't have a degree. He didn't have a university degree, and he was one of the very first professors of Chicano studies, after the San Francisco State University in 1968 that established ethnic studies in the West. And that takes me to two issues that people touch into. One is the interrelationality of movements. I mean, that Blanca also was talking about it, and in this case of actually will compel us to retell the story in more complex ways, to see how there were interlocking there was a common political culture in the moment, for instance, in which at that point the immigrant right movement was anti-racist also, and you had to retell the story of a Chicano movement. For instance, to see the relationship between the Puerto Rican Socialist Party and CASA. I mean, Zoilo Torres was sent, you know that very well, was sent to Los Angeles. And the relationship in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles of CASA and the Seccional of the Socialist Party will compel us to have a more complex view of the relationship between Chicano and Puerto Rican movement in that period, and then to see the relationship in the political culture of the moment. What is the common sense, in the sense of Gramsci? What is the way that people are thinking in that moment? And the immigrant right movement is part of what we are in that moment, and it's anti-racist at the same time. And then it gets transformed in something else, which is what Humberto is bringing now. And how, in general, what is the political culture of the common sense of the movement get transformed in ways that we lost a lot of the historical vision of the transformative political theory and politics. That is something that I think that we desperately need to recast from the Young Lords, in order to evaluate more critically what is our theory and what is our politics today. I mean, and again, I insist that this is one of the most important legacies. I want to end with the question of racism, that I think that in very interesting way, race and racism that you bring. I mean, we can problematize that in different ways, but I think that we have to talk about racial formations in plural, and we have to talk about racisms in plural also. And one of the important things of the theory, because there is theory that is produced in social movements against. movement produces intellectuals and produces theory. And part of the theory that is produced in politics, in practice, which is grounded in grassroots organization of the Young Lords, is to look at a multiplicity of forms of racisms that we live and we fight against at the same time. No, on the one hand, there is fighting against anti-black racism within the Puerto Rican community. On the anti-black in the sense of Afro-North Americans, because African American is of the Americas, but also anti-black in the sense of anti-Puerto Rican black racism, no, de pelo malo, pelo bueno, etc. But at the same time, it's fighting against a different form of racism, which is anti-Puerto Rican racism. Light and dark-skinned Puerto Ricans face racism also in the U.S. That is a racism that had to do with the fact that we're colonial migrants and that we are redefining, with the Great Migration after the post-World War II period, we're redefining race relations in the cities of the Northeast of the United States. So we need to do a more complex mapping of racial formations and racism that should still inform the kind of politics that we should do today.
On that very great note, we have one last comment. All right, we're holding on for you.
Everybody can hear me?
Listen up, please. Listen up.
All right, I'm Brother Chef. I was the original Black Panther Party here in New York, and incidentally, I was also an alumni of Hunter College back in the early 70s when there was the Black and Puerto Rican Studies Department, and I was one of the majors there. And I just wanted to real quickly, but I know people are hungry and tired and want to get to what they got to do, but the question about grassroots organizing, I think that's key, because when I went to school here, it was free tuition, open admission, so when you got out of high school, you could come to college. And so that we were able to have a vast amount of activists from the community that came into the college. And the question about street organizations, which I know the brother mentioned, but it wasn't really touched on, was really key. Because when we talk about chaplains and Black Spades and all the other groups that came out of the Bronx and Brooklyn and Manhattan and so forth that came into the colleges throughout CUNY, we're talking about people who came in not as quote-unquote gangbangers, but as people who supported the community. And that's really important for people to understand that. When you talk about Bunchy and the brother that mentioned about La Raza or the Brown Berets, when we talk about Fred and we talk about Shasha and the Young Lord, we got to also look at New York City, because most of the ranks that came out of the streets into those organizations, the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords Party, came from the community. And they were part of these street organizations. And that's where all that came out of. And people need to really look at that piece and understand, when you look at the documents that we have done research on since, I mean, Richie and myself worked on this in the past, and a lot of stuff has come up, and you can identify and look identically at the COINTELPRO documents against the organizations that were known, and also look at the street organizations that the New York City Task Force attacked in New York City. It's identical. The same tactics were utilized to destroy the street organizations in New York and parts of New Jersey. So we need to really look at that and analyze that and do that history and research on that, which has been done, so we can give you that information. Brother mentioned about the panels that are going on, some that's going to be revealed. Last but not least, I want to say is this. This is a personal thing for me, but in terms of immigration, another question that was before this brother here spoke. Okay, we are citizens of the world. I mean, we need to respect nationalities and nationhood and so forth, but we are citizens of this planet. And once we really begin to look at that, understand that is, with that respect, then we can see and get past all of that other nonsense that goes on in terms of people supposedly or allegedly coming across the borders who were here thousands of years before the Europeans came to this country in the first place. All power to people.
Beautiful note to end the evening. Thank you all for your attention, and a final thank you to our panelists, por favor.